So without further ado, we have an excellent opportunity to learn about an architect's view on the future of education. James Favaro, who's an award-winning architect principal of Johnson Favaro, an urban design firm that focuses almost entirely on the public sector, and cultural institutions across Southern California. James Favaro, welcome. The screen is yours.
Good morning from Los Angeles, California. My name is Jim, and I am an architect who practices primarily in what we call in the United States the public sector, meaning projects which are entirely funded by the taxpayer. These include community libraries, cultural community and civic institutions, as well as schools, variety of types and kinds from early education through university. And through all of that work, we are very much involved in what is taking place in the education space, in which there is a lot of anxiety and apprehension and uncertainty about what to teach to prepare our young people for the future. The uncertainty having delivered for us a kind of paradigm for how we now look at how we design school buildings, which is to think of them as neutral receptacles that can fluctuate in size and kind over time, with the ability to contract and expand, to change uses depending on the learning model that is adopted, such as hands-on learning by doing versus traditional study and lecture courses. This is the best way we believe as architects, because buildings are more permanent than programs, that we can accommodate whatever the future holds for us. All of this work takes place in Southern California, where I have lived and practiced for 35 years. The first 21 years of my life having taken place in Northern California, where I was educated in elementary and middle school in the North Bay area, high school and college in the South Bay area. I went to college at Stanford University, which lies at the northwest corner of what used to be called the Santa Clara Valley, which was known worldwide for its beauty and fertility. It was the largest agricultural producer in the country in the pre-war years. And then across the course of my youth, I watched it transform with the laying down of expressways and freeways and tract home development and business park development to become what we now know as Silicon Valley, which is a kind of cartoon of a place. It is essentially a business park on steroids, dominated by the hegemony of big tech, led by Ayn Rand inspired individualists who think of themselves as superhuman innovators, none of whom actually wants to live in Silicon Valley. They'd much rather live in San Francisco or colonize Mars or transform dumb cities into what they think are smart cities with an overlay of software. None of them, not one to a person, could ever come close to achieving what I believe is probably the greatest innovation and accomplishment of mankind, which is a wholly functional, beautiful to experience and workable city. This being an example from 2,500 years ago, the city of Plato and Aristotle, who it is said, famously said, that it was the city that was their classroom. From Stanford University, I went to architecture school across the country at Harvard University, where I found that I was, despite having announced to my parents 10 years prior at the age of 12 at the dinner table that I wanted to be an architect, I had arrived completely unprepared. And it's really because of the model of education that I experienced throughout my youth, which was in the dawning of the computer era, when the model of education was based on a conception of the human mind as a kind of information processor, where we would receive information, memorize it, and then regurgitate it on standardized tests. That evolved into a kind of idea of the brain as a machine to be maximized. In my later years, a muscle to be exercised in order to affect greater performance. Whereas what I really needed to be an architect was a frame of mind in which I was able to expand into my body and basically retrain my nervous system to coordinate eye and hand in order to make use of tools outside of my brain and to be able to see the world as a rich resource of ideas, imageries, and insight. About 20 years ago, Andy Clark and David Chalmers published a paper in which they postulated that the mind is actually not contained within our skulls, that it is extended into our bodies, our surroundings, and our relationships. And this let loose 20 years of research in cognitive psychology and neurosciences, and certainly in America. And it has been recently summarized in a beautiful compendium by Annie Paul, who is a researcher out of Yale University, who arranged her book into the same three parts that Andy Clark and David Chalmers had identified in what they called the extended mind. The last part of the book talks about pretty much what this conference is, which is how our minds are improved by our relationships with with other minds. And this is of interest to architects who in the education space really want to make facilities that facilitate that kind of exchange of ideas and in a productive, fertile learning environment. So I offer this example from the University of California, Los Angeles. At the base of one of their 20-story mid-century residential towers, there was a 20,000 square foot cafeteria that was essentially dying on the vine. And to the university's credit, they recognized that why it was dying on the vine was because students no longer lived the way they did in the 1960s. They don't take 3 square meals a day followed by 3 or 4 hours of concentrated study. They do those things in a variety of combinations all day and all night, all throughout the week and the school year in a variety of formats, individual, small group, large group, even as they're taking meals or socializing. And so we together formulated an approach for this facility that would combine the attributes of a food hall, a hotel lobby, and a university library. And this is how we did it. In the area in white is the cafeteria, the old cafeteria space. In the lower right is the kitchen itself. Between the kitchen and the cafeteria space, we placed the food hall, which is modeled on a kind of rosticceria or boulangerie, if you will, where food is available in a variety of different kinds, literally 24/7. These are students, and so they will study all day and all night. And then in the space that left over, inserted a reading room modeled on a library reading room, and that engendered 6 or 8 opportunities for a variety of kinds of spaces around it. So for example, on the east side overlooking a garden space is the East Lounge, which is modeled on a hotel lobby, albeit with carrels and tables. On the south side is a more intimately scaled lounge, off of which are 6 or 7 study rooms on the left, the reading room on the right. Beyond is community table where meals can be taken, socializing, studying, again in another kind of setting. And then beyond is what we call the deep dive study room for individual, completely quiet and concentrated study, outside of which is a more social kind of fireside lounge. The key concept being at the heart of this is acoustically sealed reading room, which is also visible to all aspects of the place. So a student can study and at once feel as part of a community and share what they're learning with their peers in a variety of settings. The idea being providing a choice so that social interactions can take place in any number of kinds of settings, depending on what it is that wants to be achieved as a group. And the second part of the book, she talks about the importance of our surroundings in elevating the quality of our thinking, and begins with an anecdote of Jonas Salk, who, as you know, created the polio vaccine in the 1950s. And he tells the story of how he was stuck in his research at the University of Pennsylvania and took leave of absence and went to the place on the right, which is the St. Francis of Assisi Monastery in Umbria in central Italy, and tells how the environment itself was key in unlocking his frame of mind and increasing his level of creativity and understanding intuitively how he would approach his research, and claims that when he returned to the University of Pennsylvania, he understood how he was going to achieve the result that he wanted. Nevertheless, we know that he succeeded. Prosperity and notoriety followed. He was able to build his own research institute, which he did here in Southern California, the coast of the Pacific. And his instruction to Louis Kahn was to emulate the characteristics of the monastery where he believed he had gotten the inspiration for the virus. It is widely, for the vaccine, it is widely recognized as a success by the scientists who occupy this institute, where, by the way, the neuroscience to which I referred previously, a lot of it is taking place here, and also by architects who consider it one of the most successful of that kind of traditional architecture in the United States. The monastery itself is kind of the apotheosis of about an 800-year development that began with the foundation of the Benedictine monasteries in the 4th century. It's named after, of course, a great Christian saint. And it is iconic in how it is a network of buildings and open space, a nested hierarchy of open spaces that are most characteristically known as cloisters and courtyards, that are the defining characteristic of what we know as the monastery building prototype that was then replicated across Europe over a 1,000-year period of time. It is a very simple, rich environment in which simple rectangular buildings enclose simple rectangular spaces, and it is celebrated actually in Ms. Paul's book as one of the most successful environments to promote the kinds of interactions and elevation of thinking that she believes is really inherent to the success of a model of the mind that is outward and not in brain bound. So for example, there are personal spaces, meditation spaces, collaboration spaces, and social spaces, which make for a rich environment for the individual, just like the UCLA example that I showed previously. And therefore, no wonder that it was a model that was adopted for the establishment of the first universities in Europe. It made its way even into California in form of the missions, 21 of which are along the El Camino Real from south to north on the coast of California. And of course, the American College campus tradition, which was initiated by Harvard University over 400 years ago and made its way across the country 250 years later at Stanford University and every place in between. There are hundreds, if not thousands, examples of these kinds of campuses in the United States. It is one of our only truly American traditions, the American College campus. And you will note that the 3 examples that I showed, the monastery, the mission, and the campus, are in fact evocations of the ancient cities to which I referred. And they are the models that we emulate when we're designing campuses, this one being at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains here in Southern California. In the first part of the book, she talks about what we all intuitively know, that we think with our bodies, with movements and gesture, and specifically the tools that we bring to bear. She tells the story of the scientists Watson and Crick, who could not actually formulate the configuration of the DNA molecule without first building a model. They actually improved their thinking by extending their thinking through their hands into the making of the model. Everyone who's watched a crime procedural will know that a detective will often display their thinking on a wall in order to understand the geographic and temporal relationships of suspects and witnesses in order to identify the perpetrator. Even arguably the most sophisticated, technologically sophisticated organization on the face of the planet, the US military, made use of a handmade model of the complex in which Osama bin Laden was thought to be hiding out in order to devise the strategy for how they would take the compound in order to capture him. And so it is with architects. The example that I showed at the beginning of the presentation did not spring wholly made from our minds. It was a process. It was through models, through a whole variety of different kinds of models, none of which ultimately are the solution, and none of which are an illustration about an idea, but are the thinking themselves. That is actually how we think through the use of these external materials. They can be very simple drawings that get transformed into more sophisticated kinds of drawings, where, as you see, we're just studying over and over and over again what the shape of this corner of the building would be until it finally congeals into an approach that turns into reality. We make use of rich variety of imagery and ideas from anywhere we can find it, whether it's a California mission or a Baroque dome or a mid-century airport terminal in order to understand. And if it's a success, which we believe it is, perhaps you may disagree, but if it is a success, there's nothing more exhilarating. One feels actually that one's mind is completely open and one feels totally alive as a human being in that kind of process and the outcome that it delivers. Jason Lanier is a technologist who has been working in Silicon Valley for 50 years. He is also a kind of humanistic futurist, if you will. He is currently consulting Microsoft on their virtual reality program. He may actually be running their virtual reality program, which is, of course, one of the current obsessions of Silicon Valley, along with the decentralized web, automation, and artificial intelligence. The latter two of which Mr. Lanier believes will greatly, as many people do, greatly modify the nature of work at the end of really what we're calling the period of post-industrial revolution, in which the kind of robotic drudgery of repetitive work will be completely eliminated, if not dissipated, in the future. And in his mind, all of us will become creators. I'm not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily use the word that he uses. I'm sure he doesn't mean artists with a capital A. I think what he means is that we will all have to learn a different frame of mind. And it's for this reason that I offered up the parable, if you will, of my own life, which I do see as a kind of microcosm of where we all may be headed. In the introduction to the book, she traces the transformation of our thinking about thinking from the information processor to the mechanized machine and muscle to be exercised to a much more open framework of the mind that really, like an architect, the way an architect makes use of the rich resources of the world, like the magpie's nest, takes whatever he or she can from the world in order to assemble something that resembles true innovation. And it is my hope that in so doing, perhaps, maybe, we will recover the capacity to create cities that we have lost in the last 100 years or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I truly appreciate the quote, "In the future, we'll all be artists." Now tell us, can we think of space as a tool?
Absolutely. That was my major point, was that our environment really does matter. And our ability to create environments that are, let's just use the word humanistic, meaning strengthening the quality and elevating the quality that I think our thinking is really important, I believe, in the quality of our thinking. And this extends not just to the classroom or to the lecture hall or to the college campus, but to our cities as well. I think we have lost the capacity to create high quality cities precisely because we are still brain bound in our thinking. We're Descartesian in our thinking. We think that we don't think with our whole selves or with each other or with our environments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would love to know what the audience think. Please go ahead and use the chat feature. There is one question posed. How much interferes architecture with the way of teaching? Does it influence both teachers and students in terms of motivation to learn better and more?
Yes, and I would refer you to Ms. Paul's book. She speaks at length about this very thing. It's why I was so attracted to the research that's going on. I guess the thing I would say about architecture is that it cannot determine behavior. It can reflect and it can enable. There's a kind of loose relationship there. But once something is built, it does affect the way we think and the way we behave. And I think this is what produces culture. Culture produces architecture, and architecture in turn produces culture. And so that's why I think it's fundamental and that we take it more seriously in terms of how we live, how we arrange ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And how would you define the future of education in 2 words?
In
we
2 words.
You. Sorry, could you repeat that again? Yes, in 2 words. It's a tough one. You can do it in 1.
Unknown.
Unknown. Well, that's very stimulating. There's one more question that I'm going to take, and then we move on. Architecture as a frozen knowledge can be so powerful, yet it is oftentimes, it's not changing. After a building has been built, how could a physical learning architecture look like that allows agility, reconfiguration, change, and transformation? Very briefly, James.
I think one of the biggest mistakes of modern architecture was to think that you could very tightly wound the shape of a building around the purpose for which it is designed. Instead, most traditional architecture actually instead creates buildings as pretty neutral containers, rectangular parallel bipeds that are like the example that I showed of classical Athens. They're basically rectangular shoeboxes, all of those buildings. So yes, you're right, buildings cannot change all that frequently. So they have to be as neutral containers as they can be to accept any number of unknown programs that may come our way. So a museum may become a housing complex, or an office building may become a museum, such as the Uffizi in Florence. I mean, those are successful buildings, ones that are neutral in their shape, but also shape the environment in which they situate.
A round of applause for James. James, thank you very much.